They are the firstborn, children of Iluvatar. Over their long lives, they would age much differently than the second-born men, and their customs would be vastly different. And while they are commonly referred to as immortal, as we dive deeper into Tolkien's world, we find that is not technically true. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the life cycle of Tolkien's elves. As we've discussed in other videos, the first elves awake at Lake Cuiviénen in the Year of the Trees 1050. Thus, the first elves are not born in the traditional sense, but created directly by Iluvatar. From this point, new elves would come in the form of offspring of these original 144. Unlike mortal women, female elves would carry their children for roughly 1 year before giving birth. While the dates were often very close to one another, it's interesting to note that it was not the birth date of an elf that was remembered from year to year, but the anniversary of their begetting. Or to put it more simply, while retaining my family-friendly terminology, the date of their conception. We are told this was because the creation of elf children required a greater share of strength of their being, in mind and in body, than in the making of mortal children. When compared to men, elves grow more swiftly in some ways, yet more slowly in others. By the time they turn 1 year old, elf children are capable of speaking, walking, and dancing. They are far more mentally mature than their human counterparts. Yet due to their capacity for longer lives, their physical bodies develop much slower. The example given in the History of Middle-earth volume Morgoth's Ring says that at the same time a child of man would enter their adulthood, a child of elves would appear no more than 7 years old. It would not be until they were 50 years old that an elf would obtain the full stature that would be with them the rest of their lives. And even then, they would need to reach 100 years before they were considered full grown. This century mark is likely when the first life cycle of the elves ends, and the second and largest likely begins. It is during their youth, generally soon after their 50th year, that elves would marry. They would marry for love and with the free will of both parties. They would be betrothed for at least 1 year prior to marriage. And in the extremely rare instance where they no longer wished to wed, the silver bands they had exchanged would be melted down, never to be used again for such a purpose. When they are married, the elves exchange their silver rings for bands of gold, worn from then on their right index finger. While the marriage of elves was typically marked with a ceremony to celebrate the occasion, if a pair of elves were to join together physically, they were from that moment married. Elf marriage is, like elves themselves, permanent. As Manwë explains in Tolkien's writings, elves by nature are bound to the world. Even should their body be slain, their spirit would remain, and re-embodiment able to follow. Thus, married couples would not be parted even in death. The departed elf spirit, or Fea, would travel to the halls of Mandos, where, after a time, they could be given their body anew, and walk in the realm of Valinor once more. One of the most famous examples of this elven reincarnation is Glorfindel, who died fighting a Balrog in the fall of Gondolin, only to return to Middle-earth in the Second Age and dwell in Rivendell. As for the potential for divorce or adultery, it is said elves already are seldom swayed by desires of the body or influenced by lust in any manner. Doing so to break the bond of marriage would be unthinkable to elves. However, there is one example of an exception where an elf had a second wife. When Miriel, wife of Finwe, the High King of the Noldor, was drained by passing so much of her life into her son Feanor, she died. She refused to be re-embodied, and with her blessing and that of the Valar, Finwe was allowed to remarry. In Tolkien's text, we see instances where spouses are separated for many long years at a time, Galadriel and Celeborn being an example. We are told this was not uncommon. Thus, although the wedded remain so forever, they do not necessarily dwell or house together at all times. For without considering the chances and separation of evil days, wife and husband, albeit united, remain persons individual having each gifts of mind and body that differ. Because spouses might be separated for long periods of time, due to battle or other circumstances, we find that elves would not conceive children or marry during days of war. Yet it would seem to any of the Eldar a grievous thing if a wedded pair were sundered during the bearing of a child, or while the first years of its childhood lasted, for which reason the Eldar would beget children only in days of happiness and peace if they could. As we've hinted at already, bearing an elven child was no small undertaking. It required a great deal of strength of body and mind to bring forth a child of the Eldar. Thus, elves would typically have few children, often 4 or less. Feanor and his wife Nerdanel being the rare exception, having 7 sons. While elves would be capable of procreation for many ages, after having children, sometimes spread over the course of centuries, their desire to have more children soon ceases. Tolkien says, "The union of love is indeed to them great delight and joy, and the days of children, as they call them, remain in their memory as the most merry in life. But they have many other powers of body and of mind, which their nature urges them to fulfill." Even after having passed their days of the children, the elves are still in their second cycle. The second cycle is one that can last for ages. During these long years, they would spend their days pursuing arts and knowledge. We see the incredible works that elves are capable of throughout history in things like smithing, sculpture, music, healing, and others. As the elves age, they would not outwardly appear any different than when they had reached full maturity. Yet, internally, they would become more and more weary of the sorrows of the world. They are ageless beings in an aging world, doomed to be bound to it until its ending. And here we come to a topic that is often simplified to immortality, but it is far more complex. What the elves truly have, as Tolkien described it, is serial longevity. For they are bound to Arda, the created world, and when the ending of the world should come, so comes the ending of the elves, and their fate on that day is unknown. While they may endure all the days of the world, they can merely place their hope in the one that there will be days for them after the world's ending. But beyond the second life cycle of the elves, there was a third. This period, which came after their age of acquiring skill, knowledge, and wisdom, was when elves were truly ancient. The most famous of these is Cirdan the Shipwright, who was born at Cuivienen and was well over 11,000 years old by the time he would finally sail into the West. He is noted to have a beard, something that was said to only come in an elf's third life cycle, with the exception of Feanor's father-in-law, Matan, who had one early in his second cycle. While the third cycle by tradition is for the most ancient of elves, it does appear that elves can be forced into this age as the result of a tragedy befalling them. There are perhaps examples of this, primarily in the First Age. Here we find that after Luthien's initial death, the result of her sorrow at Beren's passing, has a tremendous effect on her father Thingol. But the spirit of Luthien fell down into darkness, and at the last it fled, and her body lay like a flower that is suddenly cut off and lies for a while unwithered on the grass. Then a winter, as it were the hoar age of mortal men, fell upon Thingol. While perhaps a rather amusing homophone, this hoar age of men refers to being gray-haired with age. In another example of elves aging when they should not have by their nature is Gwyndor. Much of his tale is told in the Children of Húrin, where he returns to Nargothrond with Turin Turambar after escaping years of thraldom in the pits of Angband. When he returns home, at first his own people did not know Gwyndor, who went out young and strong, and returned now seeming as one of the aged among mortal men, because of his torments and his labors. We know that the elves are tied to the world itself, and that unlike men, their spirits would not leave the circles of the world even if slain. But what about potential elves who chose not to sail west, as even Cirdan would finally do? How would the elves fare should they not go to the Undying Lands, and remain in those where the age of men had come? Tolkien gives us a glimpse once again in Morgoth's Ring. As the weight of the years, with all their changes of desire and thought, gathers upon the spirit of the Eldar, so do the impulses and moods of their bodies change. This the Eldar mean when they speak of their spirits consuming them. And they say that ere Arda ends, all the Eldaliae on Earth will have become as spirits invisible to mortal eyes, unless they will to be seen by some among men into whose minds they may enter directly. Thus, the eventual end of the elves remaining in Middle-earth is that their physical bodies would fade, becoming spirits, visible only to those they willed and used Osanwe, or mind communication with. There are some who could have chosen this fate, such as Elladan and Elrohir, the brothers of Arwen. Yet we are never conclusively told who among the elves remained in Middle-earth unto its ending. And Elladan and Elrohir's choice remains a mystery. So is the fate of the elves, to be bound to a world that from its beginning is marred by the evils of Morgoth, a world of conflict, a world of fading beauty. To men, it may seem a joyous thing to be unburdened by the weight of mortality, yet the doom of the elves is to remain in a world of decay, ending when it ends, their spirits unable to join the one as men do, and they are left to hope that they should be part of the world made anew. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.